Welcome to the Blast From the Pastcast. I think I said it right that time.
Finally, yeah.
Okay.
After,
Third time recording.
Yeah, after about our 7th intro.
I am Matthew Churchill, and as always, even though this is the first episode of this show specifically, Curtis Smith.
Hey guys. So, as you mentioned, obviously, new show, which we announced last week. We're ready to go and pretty excited, actually. As I mentioned, obviously, last week on our announcement episode, first series we're jumping into for this new show is going to be on Egypt. And again, as I mentioned before, first episode is on mythology and the religion type of stuff, which we had to do, which, like I said, mostly just because I find it fun. And with Egypt, it's very important because of mummification and the pyramids and all that stuff that we're gonna end up diving into later down the line. So, all these mythology episodes are gonna follow a similar format where go through the origin story, the pantheon of like the more major gods that we're gonna we go through. So with Greece, for example, that's where I'm most familiar. It'll be like the 12 major gods of Olympus rather than going through 40 different gods, because obviously each group of people has a ton of different ones that they can go through, but we're just going to focus on the major ones, mostly for the sake of time. Potentially anyone that is sort of there that affects the series or affects some stories. We're going to go through them as well. And then, sort of more of the noteworthy items and the fun stories and myth, anything like that we find that we want to share.
And the kind of like a slight evolution of the pantheon, because
Yeah, sort of, like I said, this is all, like, these series, or these episodes are going to be a little more, they're still going to be researched, obviously, but they're going to be more sort of just for fun, almost. A little bit of context definitely is going to be given, especially with Egypt, because of the direct way that it affected, especially the pharaohs, who clearly play a major role.
Expositional episodes.
Yeah. So like I said, obviously ancient mythology is important to every group of people we're going to cover, but specifically Egypt, because mummies, the pyramids, even the hieroglyphics that you go through. That's why, especially with Egypt, and generally I find it important to discuss each people's religions and myth. And mythologies, rather. So, as far as the origin story of Egypt is concerned, I want to get into that. Firstly, obviously, Egypt is located in the northeastern portion of Africa.
The utmost northeastern in Africa.
Yeah, exactly. So it borders the Mediterranean Sea in the north and is surrounded almost entirely by desert. To the west is the Sahara Desert, and to the east is the Sinai Peninsula, and pretty much the entire Middle East. Obviously, like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Syria, that type of area. So, being that they're in a desert, it's obviously not exactly ideal living conditions outside of the Nile River outside of the Nile River Delta, which is, of course, the main source of water for the ancient Egyptians, as well as being basically their most significant natural resource, as far as it provides water and travel. And it actually made the Nile River Delta, which flows out into the Mediterranean Sea, one of a huge area as far as farming was concerned, and therefore it allowed for Egypt to what would have been in a very difficult to inhabit area become the largest empire in that area of the world for a very, very long time. What's interesting about the Nile River is it actually flows sort of backward, like it flows backwards. So it flows up and out into the Mediterranean Sea. So it flows north rather than flowing south, and even a little bit like it's an interesting that in and of itself. The actual geography is pretty interesting. Not exactly not super relevant to this particular series, because it is kind of just the geography. I'm just giving an explanation as to where it is, or as to where Egypt was and what allowed Egypt to go from a desert to, like I said, the biggest empire in that area of the world for a pretty significant portion of time. So to get into the religious aspects of life, for almost the entire existence of the ancient Egyptian empire, so prior to, basically from just before Egypt became Egypt to essentially when Alexander took over with the Greeks, Egypt was polytheistic, so that means they worshipped multiple gods, such as Ra and Anubis. Just those are two we're going to get into later. There were some smaller portions of time where, during the New Kingdom, Egypt became a monotheistic society, meaning just one god, which, like I said, that's going to get covered later down the line because it's not as significant for the mythology episode. But when we're into covering the New Kingdom, that is obviously going to be talked about. So, you're going to say something?
If I recall correctly, that was a very, very short period of time.
It was a very short period of time during the New Kingdom, where the capital was moved, and then it was, upon the death of Akhenaten, was moved back to Thebes, where that was essentially all that King Tut did throughout his reign as pharaoh. So, I hit something. That was just the keyboard. Anyways, so the creation story goes sort of along the lines of this, but obviously I'm wanting to note that because it's so old, there are obviously different versions of the story that have appeared throughout history, as with most civilizations. But I've come to just sort of one that I'm going to discuss, that sort of brings everything together and is generally what you're going to find from most people. So that's what I want to tell you. It begins with Adam. Atum.
Not Adam from down the street.
Not Adam as in like Adam and Eve, but like
Atom,
yeah. Before Adam, there was chaos, which was called Nun. Nun. Very, very adeptly named. So, from that chaos, Adam created Earth. He was essentially the original god, the creator. So, over a long period of time, Earth was created, and the gods established kingdoms. Eventually, they left Earth, and the pharaohs inherited the right to rule from them. So, the Book of the Dead, which is a very significant text for both pharaohs and commoners, which it dates to around the Second Intermediate period of Egypt, which again we're going to cover that when we get fully into the history. It describes that before Adam there was none, an infinite amount of nothingness. It was personified as 4 sets of male and female deities throughout the Book of the Dead. And essentially, Adam created himself, and then created Earth. He became the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and as such wears the double crown of Egypt, which is a red and white crown worn by the pharaoh of Egypt, who would signify himself as the ruler of two lands, which were Upper and Lower Egypt. Which again, we're gonna cover why that crown exists, what Upper and Lower Egypt are on the next few episodes throughout this series, as we cover essentially the foundations of Egypt and its beginnings into sort of the whole pre-dynastic period, and then getting into the Old Kingdom and the pyramids and whatnot on the next series for Egypt. So, as I said, Adam was the god of of heaven and earth, and the pharaoh Upper and Lower Egypt. Adam also was shown to carry an ankh, which is the symbol of life for the Egyptians, and was often used as a royal scepter for the pharaohs.
Spell Ankh for those who don't know.
Oh, Ankh.
Ankh.
Ankh, which our buddy Noah used to wear an ankh necklace, even though he's fucking Catholic. I have no idea why.
It looks cool.
Yeah, honestly. So, according to the pyramid texts written on the walls of some of the great pyramids of Giza, or Giza, whatever you want to pronounce it as, I don't really care. Whatever works for you. The creator god emerged from the chaotic darkness of none as a mythical Bennu bird, which is similar to a heron or a phoenix. Not Phoenix, Arizona.
Just the entire city.
The entire city just appears from nothing.
I wouldn't be surprised, honestly.
Yeah, it basically
With how
is
hot
nothing.
it is, like, nothingness I would assume is very hot, and just Phoenix.
So, the bird, Adam, flew to Heliopolis, which is an ancient city near the modern capital of Cairo, where at dawn he alighted the Ben, which is an ancient obelisk representing a ray of the sun.
Ben sounds like something you would call your, 5-month-old son named Ben.
Fair enough.
Ben.
Yeah.
Or your cat. I don't know.
Fair enough. Obelisks are also going to play a fairly significant role, especially in the New Kingdom, because we have a female pharaoh who builds a shitload of obelisks because dick monuments. Swear to God, that's actually real.
Dicks.
Yeah. Basically, an obelisk is a big dick monument. So, everybody who likes the Washington Monument, it's a monument to George Washington's penis. Enjoy knowing that. After fashioning a nest, he was consumed in a fire and miraculously sprang back to life, this bird. The capstone placed at the top of an obelisk or pyramid is associated with the Bennu, and it's called a pyramidion, or the Bennu, and it's a symbol of rebirth and immortality, which is kind of the whole goal with the pyramids and the mummification and everything we're going to get into later on in this episode. So, Adam had 2 children. Shu, I believe that's how it's pronounced, or it could be Shu, but I'm going to say Shu, and Tefnut. The god Tefnut was the god of dry air the god Shu was the god of dry air and light, while Tefnut, his wife, the goddess of the more corrosive moist air. Those two then had kids. I know, incest, gross. That is going to be another theme throughout this whole series, throughout the whole of Egypt, and frankly throughout most of history leading up to about the end of World War I, as far as royals are concerned. So those two then had kids, Geb and Nut. I know. Nut. So Geb became the god of dry land, and was the first landing place for the sun god Re or Ra. Doesn't really matter how you pronounce it. It works. You'll see it either RE or RA in most cases. It doesn't really matter. It's the same god regardless. So however you'd like to pronounce it is acceptable. Nut, meanwhile, was the sky.
The sky.
Yeah. So Geb and Nut then produced four more children. You look like you want you want to say something.
I do, but it's keep going.
Okay. All right. Feel free to jump in and say whatever you'd like to say.
I know, but it might offend someone, so no.
Oh yeah, you're right. So those four children were Osiris, Set, Isis, and
Not that ISIS. Not that.
and Nephthys. I know. Great. So as far as the rest of the pantheon is concerned, there's Mot, who is the goddess of justice and truth, and whose feather is the heart. A person's heart is measured against in the afterlife, which we're going to discuss later. Anubis is the jackal-headed god of mummification.
Nasus.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Just for comparison, if you know who Nasus is from League of Legends, that
Fair enough.
from what he looks like.
Thoth is the ibis-headed god of wisdom. Horus is the falcon-headed god who lived within the pharaoh. And his wife, Hathor, the goddess of love, makes up the majority of the most significant gods in Egypt. Now, Ra, who eventually became Amun-Ra during the New Kingdom, because that was a new god that was specifically worshipped throughout the New Kingdom when the capital moved north or south from Memphis to the city of Thebes. That's when the New Kingdom started. Set was the god of trouble, so almost a little similar to Hermes, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, as far as the whole being a troublemaker is concerned, or to some extent Loki as well, for those with Norse mythology or Marvel fans.
I love Tom Hiddleston.
I know. His brother, Osiris, essentially was the king of the dead. He was the person who would deliver the final judgment on if somebody would go to the afterlife or not.
Yeah, this guy's fairly dead.
Yeah, basically. So Osiris and Set actually have kind of a cool story as to how Osiris became Osiris.
I am Osiris. Aha! Boom. Or just. No.
Yeah. So I want to tell that story first, and then we're going to talk about the whole death and afterlife thing, which I think is pretty interesting. Osiris and his wife Isis were the original rulers of Egypt. Now this made Set pretty jealous. He was not happy.
Not a happy boy.
Now, what finally made him snap is not necessarily clear. Some people have, like, some texts sort of allude to the fact that it could have been Osiris and Nephthys having a little bit of sexy time, which Set was obviously not happy about because that's Set's wife, because both of them married their sisters. Not good, basically. But eventually, it leads to Set murdering Osiris and cutting up his body and dumping it into the Nile. Now, that's the story. That part of the story is a little debated because some stories say that he was cut into a casket, then thrown into the Nile, and then eventually found by Isis, where Set then cut him up later. either way, it does involve Osiris being murdered, thrown in the Nile, and cut up. The exact order of that doesn't, it changes throughout the story or throughout different depictions of that story, but that's the main points of it.
No, you throw the eggs into the batter, then you...
Yeah. Eventually, his body is found by Isis and Horus, and he's bandaged up and reassembled, and the bandages make him essentially look like a mummy, which is why he's typically depicted with the white crown, with the white crown, and bandaged up like a mummy with his arms crossed and the in his hands both an ankh and another essentially stick. Eventually, upon reassembly, Osiris came back to life, and he would become the ruler of the land of the dead. Horus and Set fought, and Horus eventually won, which made him the king of Egypt, while, of course, Osiris went on to become the ruler of the dead. And that's why Horus he inhabits the pharaoh. The pharaoh is essentially just referred to as the great house throughout throughout his existence, because he's inhabited by Horus, and that's what gives him sort of the right to rule in the minds of the Egyptians. So much like how getting into Europe, it became the divine right of kings, where it was like, well, you are born to rule, and God has dictated that you are the ruler, so therefore that's just what you are. So as far as death is concerned, Egypt had a pretty cool philosophy and ritual. According to them, each person has 3 souls: the Ka, Ba, and Akh. Not Ankh, but Akh, A-K-H. And in order for these 3 to function properly, the body has to survive the transition to the next life fully intact. To do this, eventually they settled on mummification, which that's why we have the bodies of a lot of pharaohs still today, where you can go to a museum in Cairo and you can see the body of Ramesses the Great, or you can see the body of Tut. Meanwhile, the bodies of other rulers like Julius Caesar, for example, are long since gone. That's like I said, because a lot, getting later in, a lot of other civilizations didn't go through the whole mummification process, and for that reason, the bodies decayed like normal bodies, in opposition to being mummified and surviving, now 5,000 years later.
06, if you're from the future.
Yeah, it depends on when you're watching this, sure. As I said, the body had to be identifiable so that the souls could then re-inhabit it and transition into the next life. The next life, or the next world rather, was thought to be west of the Nile, in the Sahara Desert, which just often is referred to as the Kingdom of the West, where in order to get there, the deceased would have to go through a series of tests to see if they lived well and deserved to successfully transition into the next life. Firstly, they had to convince an old ferryman to take them across the River of Death. So this, I believe, and it eventually, or it seems like the Greeks borrowed this idea for their own mythology, as far as they would bury people with two gold coins on their eyes, so they could pay Charon, the ferryman, to take them across the river Styx, which is pretty well similar to this particular story. Eventually, they would have to, if they successfully did that, they would then have to progress through a number of trials. Hopefully, the deceased would have the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Death, as well as a number of different amulets and other items that would help them through the many dangers they would encounter. Eventually, they would, or if they made it through, they would eventually confront the 42 assessors of Mott. They would read a list of sins which the dead man would have to swear he didn't commit. If he passed the judgment, he would then move to the Hall of Osiris, where they would weigh his heart, and the heart was actually kept within the body after death, so that it could be used in this ritual where they would balance his heart against the feather of truth, which was a feather from the wings of Mott, who is obviously, as I mentioned, they're depicted with wings. If the deceased lived a virtual life, their heart would balance, and he could join they could join their ancestors in the Kingdom of the West. However, if they were evil, if they were a sinner, their heart would be heavy, and they would be fed to the Devourer, which is a crocodile, hippo, lion hybrid who would consume the dead person, and they were just gone. They no longer exist.
But what if it was so light that the feather weighed down? Would she be eaten?
That just didn't happen because it was Mott is the goddess of justice.
Yeah, but what if she was bad? Justice is subjective.
I see. Thank you, Matt. Now, this process was actually the same for everyone, regardless of if they were a commoner or if they were the pharaoh. That said, pharaohs were of course buried in ornate, these very ornate tombs. Most famously, the pyramids of Giza, and which later in this first series on Egypt, we're going to discuss the building of the pyramids, I believe. Probably. Otherwise, it would be on the next one. They would then, eventually Egypt would move south to the city of Thebes, where they would then have the Valley of the Kings, and the massive temples to different gods at Karnak and Luxor. Now, the Valley of the Kings was where most of the bodies of was where many of the pharaohs whose bodies that actually still exist have been found. So, the pharaoh they were buried in these extremely ornate tombs so that they could still have, or so they were buried with all their earthly belongings. And that the Egyptians believed that they needed, or that they would use them in the next life, and for that reason, that's why the Valley of the Kings and the pyramids, each burial was, or each tomb was so, it was very difficult to progress through, and there were a bunch of traps throughout, so that grave robbers would have a much more difficult time stealing anything. So the pharaoh, as I said, was inhabited by the god Horus, who is typically shown with a falcon head. He would then, eventually, if that pharaoh was too old and sick and he would eventually die, of course, Horus would move to the next pharaoh, his next home, essentially, which was most times the son of the pharaoh. Now, as far as mummification is concerned, I want to cover that now. So, the organs would be removed from the body and placed in what was called canopic jars, except for the heart, which I mentioned obviously is needed in the afterlife in the judgment of the Hall of Osiris, and the brain, which the Egyptians actually just thought was pretty well useless crap.
The brain's just mush.
Yeah, so the brain would be, they would take a big long stick, shove it up the person's nose into the brain, and jiggle it around a whole bunch so that the brain was turned into mush, and then it would flow out of the nose. Pretty gross.
It's nice juice.
Yeah, basically, like I said, that's basically exactly what it was. They thought it was just crap, which is obviously interesting because the brain is everything. So the body, after all the organs and stuff were removed, the cavity, like the cavity would be filled with a whole bunch of stuff, sort of to prevent the ribs from collapsing, as well as a bunch of spices and all this type of stuff.
You probably smell nice.
Yeah. And then the body would then be covered in natron, which is essentially a salt, for a period of time. All the salt would then be washed after the body had essentially gotten rid of all the moisture and been mummified. They would then be wrapped in linen, and throughout the linen, amulets and the heart scarab, which a scarab is a beetle. A heart scarab was just another amulet. It would be placed throughout the wrapping, and those amulets and stuff would be used by the dead person throughout the trial portion of the afterlife. The jars, each of them actually had the head of a different god on them, where certain organs would be stored, like the liver and the lungs. You'd see different gods. Typically, Anubis would certainly be one of them. So the heads would mostly be animal-headed gods, like Anubis and Thoth. So you might be asking, what's the deal with the animal heads? You're not asking?
What's with the animal heads? Cue Seinfeld theme.
Yeah. Each god actually had a reason behind the animal head that they were shown to have or depicted with.
It was a favorite animal.
Yeah. Great. So Anubis, the god of mummification, was a jackal. And the reason behind that was, prior to mummification, prior to the Egyptians settling on it, they would bury the bodies in these really shallow graves, and then the super dry air of the desert and the sand would eventually, it would help to preserve the bodies. It preserved the bodies. That being said, jackals, which are kind of dog-wolf type of things.
Dog wolf.
Yeah. They would be frequently seen to be rooting through these graves, scavenging for food because they could smell the body. Which really hurt the Egyptians as far as preservation of bodies was concerned, and that helped to lead to why they chose eventually mummification rather than just continuing that throughout their whole existence. Now, Thoth, who is the god of wisdom, was shown to be an ibis, which is a big bird, similar to a heron.
Not Big Bird from Sesame Street. Completely different, no relation.
Very different. No, he was a large bird, not Big Bird. Thank you for the clarification.
Also, wasn't yellow.
No, ibises are not yellow. I don't believe that. I mean, maybe canaries are that yellow, but that's a big canary.
What the ibis is what, like light blue or something? Light blue, something like that.
Herons are. Yeah. An ibis is fairly similar to to a heron, just in Africa. Now, because because Thoth was the god of wisdom, typically he would use papyrus, which was also used by most of the Egyptians as far as the regular writings were concerned, not like the preserved hieroglyphics, which we'll cover later down the line. The language, the hieroglyphs at least, because they're pretty interesting. So as I said, Thoth would use papyrus, and what bird is frequently seen, or was frequently seen, living amongst the papyrus reeds across the Nile River Delta?
Crocodiles.
Crocodiles are not birds.
Crocodile.
Crocodiles are not birds, in fact. It was an ibis. Hence why Thoth was depicted as an ibis. Not a crocodile.
Eagle. Got it.
Osiris, he is depicted essentially as a mummy, which, and like I said, that makes sense from the story of Set and Osiris, which I obviously already told. Now, he was very significant to everybody, but especially to commoners, because Osiris was the man who judged the souls of the dead, and just determined whether you lived a virtuous life and would be able to pass on essentially into heaven, or if you were getting fed to the Devourer, where literally just consumed.
Consume.
Yeah. So yeah, that's like Osiris was pretty significant to everybody, of course, and part of the other thing was with the pyramids, which were built during the Old Kingdom. That was the original burial place for some of the pharaohs, such as Khufu, who we'll cover later.
No, he said Kofu. Khufu, not tofu.
Yeah. That they would be protected by a sphinx, which is obviously the big cat thing with the head of a man. Now, Sphinx is seen throughout throughout a lot of Egyptian mythology, and even into some Greek mythology, but mostly just where it deals with Egypt. All that is coming later down the line as far as Greece is concerned. But the Sphinx was essentially meant to be a protector for the pharaoh and to protect them from all the evil stuff, grave robbers and stuff like that, which didn't exactly work because a lot of these would be a lot of these pyramids and a lot of the Valley of the Kings would have been, it was gone through and stolen, like all this stuff was stolen by grave robbers, which is why King Tut became significant and became anything more than just another pharaoh who did nothing really important. Because historically speaking, Tut really did nothing outside of be found in 1922 by Howard Carter, which KV-63 is really not even it wasn't created for King Tut, which is very interesting to talk about, and we're going to go through that later when we get into the New Kingdom of Egypt. Why that's very, very significant, what's going on with that particular area.
One thing of why I think some of it was grave robbed was, although I'm not an Egyptologist, so correct me if I'm wrong, was that a lot of these chaps couldn't be rearmed, or weren't rearmed. Were they?
No, a lot of them weren't, and the reason they tried to go through all this is there's a shitload of gold and expensive stuff in these tombs. Like, if you've seen the pictures taken from KV-63, which, for context, that's the name given to King Tut, his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Not because he was like the 63rd pharaoh or anything, just because that was the 63rd tomb they found within the Valley of the Kings, and was the first one found, and pretty much the only one found entirely intact, unopened after, like, essentially 3,500 years. Because King Tut died around 1500 BC, and then leading into, and then obviously 1922 is a long ways from that. So that's just a little bit of context as to what I mean when I say KV63. Yeah. So however, that we've gone through the mythology and all the religious stuff with Egypt, we can start on the history, and that is where we'll pick back up on the next episode of this series on ancient Egypt.
Next episode.
Yeah. Next episode. So, yeah, that's sort of our first. That's sort of our first episode on Egypt. Like I mentioned, we've got a lot more coming down the pipeline. Most of it is going to deal with the pre-dynastic period. So that is the lead up to Egypt as it became truly ancient Egypt. This is sort of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and all that type of lovely stuff.
Just for clarification, as it's been like a little bit since I took history myself, Upper and Lower Egypt is kind of the same idea as Upper and Lower Canada, correct?
Well, they were literally Upper Egypt was north.
Oh, okay. I thought it was similar to like
No, it was just Upper Egypt was literally just north, and that's why it's Upper Egypt, and that's why Lower Egypt.
For whatever reason, I was remembering it as the same thing as
north. Upper Egypt was the area of Memphis, which
not Tennessee.
Yeah. No. Although interestingly, with that, Memphis was the home of the kings, and then Memphis, Tennessee, was the home of the king, Elvis Presley. So, fun little, yeah, seriously. Okay. That's just a little stupid sidebar that I stole from a former teacher of mine. Anyways, Upper Egypt was that area was like Memphis and Cairo, and Lower Egypt was like Thebes, which also Thebes was important in Greek history, but a different Thebes. There was Thebes in Egypt and then Thebes in Greece. So more lovely stuff.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, that's all going to come down the pipeline in the next, in the next few, like in the series that we're going to be leading up to. Yeah, so that's pretty much the beginning episode for us for Egypt. Yeah, so what do we have to do now? We've got to plug the Twitters and stuff like that. Obviously, at DravardMC for Matt and at Curtis Smitty for myself. You guys can also subscribe to the channel, obviously, if you enjoyed the episode. And you've got our other show that you can listen to as well. Which
should have came out earlier today.
Yeah, it'll have come out earlier today. Should be probably a couple hours before this was posted. We haven't really decided on a specific time yet, but we're gonna try and have everything be pretty consistent.
Try to at least.
Yeah. Well, consistent as far as time is concerned for when it gets uploaded. We're gonna make sure that both shows get uploaded all the time and whatnot. So that's episode 1 on Egypt, and like I said, subscribe to the channel, all that type of lovely stuff. Twitter. Yeah, that's pretty well it. So, thank you guys for listening.
Egyptologist Anonymous.